The sense of identity that feels so familiar often appears as something discovered rather than something created. It seems as though you were born as a particular person and have simply been unfolding that identity over time. Your preferences, your reactions, your way of thinking all appear to confirm that there is a stable core defining who you are. But when attention begins to observe more closely, another possibility starts to emerge. What if identity is not something found, but something constructed? From early in life, the mind begins absorbing information about the world and about itself. Words are used to describe you. Behaviors are labeled, reactions from others begin to shape how you see yourself. You are told what you are good at, what you struggle with, how you should behave, what is expected of you. These impressions do not remain as isolated pieces of information. They begin to form patterns. A reaction is remembered, a label is repeated, a behavior is reinforced. Slowly the mind begins to organize these elements into a coherent image. The image becomes the beginning of identity. Over time, the image becomes more detailed. New experiences are added, interpretations are laid on top. Emotional responses strengthen certain aspects while others fade. The mind continuously adjusts the image, refining it, protecting it, sometimes even trying to improve it. Yet at no point is there a moment where identity is fully complete. It is always being updated, always being interpreted, always being shaped by thought. What makes this process difficult to see is how natural it feels. The construct identity appears so consistent that it seems real in the same way physical objects appear real. It feels as though there is someone solid behind the thoughts, behind the reactions, behind the memories. But what attention begins to notice is that this solidity comes from repetition. The same patterns are recalled again and again. The same descriptions are reinforced, the same emotional responses are revisited. Through repetition, the constructed image begins to feel stable. And that stability is mistaken for something inherent. Yet if the repetition slows, if the mind pauses its constant referencing, the sense of identity begins to lose some of its definition. Not because something real is disappearing, but because what was constructed is no longer being actively maintained. And in that moment, a quiet question begins to appear. If identity must be continuously constructed in order to feel real, what is it that remains when the construction is not taking place? As the constructed nature of identity begins to come into view, another layer reveals itself with surprising clarity. Much of what you believe yourself to be is not only shaped by memory and experience, but by language. The mind does not simply experience. It describes. From the earliest moments of learning, words begin to organize perception. Objects are named, actions are labeled, emotions are defined. Slowly the world becomes structured through language. And within that structure, the sense of self begins to take form. At some point, the word I becomes central. I feel, I think, I want, I am this kind of person. Each of these statements appears simple, almost automatic, yet within them something very significant is happening. Experience is being translated into language, and within that translation, a subject is created. The subject is me. What is often overlooked is that the word comes first and the identity follows. A sensation appears, and almost instantly it is described. I feel something. A thought arises, and it is labeled. I am thinking. Through repetition, the mind begins to associate all experience with a central reference point defined through language. But if attention slows down and observes carefully, the structure becomes clearer. A sensation appears, then a word describes it. Then the word I is added to that description. The identity is formed within the sentence. Without the linguistic structure, the experience itself does not necessarily contain a personal center. There is simply sensation, simply perception, simply awareness of what is happening. It is language that organizes experience into a narrative with a subject. And once that subject is established, the mind continues building around it. Descriptions accumulate. I am confident. I am anxious. I am someone who struggles. I am someone who succeeds. Each statement reinforces the image. Each label becomes part of the identity. Over time, the labels begin to feel permanent. The mind forgets that they were constructed through language and starts to treat them as facts about reality. Yet they are interpretations. They are conclusions drawn from patterns of experience, expressed through words and repeated until they feel true. When attention begins to see this clearly, something subtle starts to shift. The words lose some of their authority. A thought may still appear saying, I am this, or I am that. But now it is seen as a description, not a definition. The identity begins to look less like something fixed and more like something spoken into existence moment after moment. And when the speaking slows, even slightly, the sense of a solid me begins to soften along with it.
As language continues to shape the structure of identity, another movement quietly takes place beneath the surface. The mind does not only describe experience through words, it begins to believe those descriptions. At first, a statement such as, I am this kind of person, may simply appear as a thought. It may arise in response to a situation based on a memory or a reaction. But when the same description is repeated over time, something begins to change in how it is perceived. The thought starts to feel like a fact. The mind gradually stops seeing the statement as something it is saying and begins to experience it as something that is true. The distinction between description and reality becomes blurred. What was once an interpretation becomes something that feels inherent. This shift happens subtly. A memory appears, and the mind draws a conclusion from it. That conclusion is expressed through language. Then the same conclusion is repeated in similar situations. Each repetition strengthens the sense of certainty. Eventually, the description no longer feels like something created. It feels discovered. For example, a few moments of difficulty may lead to the thought, I am not good at this. If that thought is repeated often enough, the mind begins to treat it as a stable characteristic. Future experiences are then filtered through that belief. Situations are interpreted in a way that confirms it. Contradictory evidence may be overlooked or dismissed. In this way, the belief reinforces itself. The identity becomes self-validating. The mind believes something about itself, and then perceives the world through that belief, finding confirmation wherever it looks. What began as a simple interpretation gradually becomes the lens through which experience is understood. But when attention observes this process carefully, something important becomes visible. The belief is still a thought. No matter how often it has been repeated, no matter how convincing it feels, it remains a mental construction. It exists as a pattern of thinking that has been reinforced over time. Yet because it is rarely questioned, it becomes invisible. The mind does not see the belief, it sees through it. Everything is interpreted in relation to it, and as a result, the belief appears to describe reality itself. This is how identity gains its sense of solidity, not because it is fixed, but because it is constantly confirmed. But the moment attention turns towards the belief itself, rather than looking through it, the structure begins to change. The statement, "I am this," is seen as a thought. It appears, it is recognized. It can be observed in the same way any other thought is observed. And in that moment, the certainty that once surrounded it begins to loosen. The identity is no longer invisible. It becomes something that is seen. And what is seen clearly no longer holds the same unquestioned authority it once had. As the mind begins to believe the descriptions it creates, another shift quietly takes place in the way reality itself is experienced. Identity no longer functions only as a set of ideas about who you are. It begins to influence how the world is perceived. At first, this influence may seem subtle. A situation appears, and the mind interprets it based on past experience. This is natural, but over time, the interpretation becomes so immediate that it begins to feel like perception itself. The mind no longer notices that it is interpreting. It feels as though it is simply seeing what is there. Yet what is being seen is already shaped by the identity the mind believes it has. If the mind carries the belief that it is not valued, interactions with others may be perceived through that lens. Neutral expressions may seem dismissive. Silence may feel like rejection. Small details are selected and emphasized in a way that confirms the existing narrative. If the mind believes it is confident and capable, the same situation may be experienced entirely differently. Uncertainty may be interpreted as opportunity. Challenge may feel engaging rather than threatening. The external situation has not changed, but the experience of it has. This reveals something important. Perception is not purely objective. It is filtered. The identity acts as a lens through which reality is interpreted, and over time that interpretation becomes so consistent that it begins to feel like reality itself. The mind does not question the lens because it has become invisible. It simply assumes that what it sees is what is. This is how identity begins to shape experience at a deeper level.
It is no longer just a story told about life. It becomes the framework through which life is lived. But when attention turns towards this process, the structure begins to reveal itself. A reaction appears, a judgment forms, a meaning is assigned to what is happening. And if observation is clear, it becomes possible to see that these are not the raw elements of experience. They are additions. They arise after the initial perception. In the brief moment before interpretation, something very simple is present. Color, sound, movement, sensation. Then thought enters. It labels, it compares, it concludes, and almost instantly, the identity is reintroduced into the moment. The experience becomes personal again. But now something has changed. The process has been seen. And once it is seen, it becomes possible to recognize that perception itself is not fixed. It is shaped. It is influenced. It is colored by the identity the mind has constructed. And in recognizing this, the certainty of that identity begins to weaken. Because what once seemed like reality is now understood to be interpretation. And interpretation, no matter how convincing, is still something the mind is doing. When the constructed nature of identity is seen clearly from beginning to end, something begins to fall away without effort. For a long time, the mind has been engaged in maintaining the image of who you are. It has remembered, compared, defended, improved, and projected this identity across time, believing it to be the center of experience. But when every part of this structure is observed, the memory, the language, the belief, the comparison, the defense, the projection, something becomes undeniable. The identity is not something that exists independently. It is something that is continuously created. And because it is created, it does not need to be destroyed. It simply needs to be seen. This seeing is not an action taken by the mind to remove identity. It is not an effort to become someone without a self. It is a quiet recognition of how the entire structure has been operating. The moment this recognition is complete, the weight carried by identity begins to dissolve on its own. Thoughts about me may still appear. They arise as they always have, but they no longer carry the same authority. They are recognized as movements within the mind, not as definitions of reality. The story may continue to be told when needed, but it is no longer believed in the same way. And in the absence of that belief, something very simple begins to stand out. Experience is already complete without the need for a constructed center. Seeing happens. Hearing happens. Sensation happens. Life unfolds in real time without requiring a narrator to hold it together. The mind may still describe what is happening, but the description is no longer mistaking for the experience itself. There is a quiet separation between what is and what is said about what is. And in that separation, a different kind of clarity begins to appear. Not a clarity built from thought, not an understanding formed through conclusions, but a direct recognition that awareness itself has never depended on identity. It has always been present before the story began. It
remains present while the story appears. And it is unchanged when the story falls silent. What remains is not a new version of the self. It is not a refined identity or a better concept of who you are. What remains is simply the open field in which all identity has been appearing. Unconstructed, unlabeled, unaffected. And in that openness, the search for who you are comes quietly to an end. Not because an answer has been found, but because the question no longer holds the same meaning.